commons needed to be turned into what we think of as private property, you know, individual plots, in order to be worked efficiently. So I think she's one of the people who has removed that as a justification. So independent subsistence farmers and artisans were left no choice in a lot of cases but to farm for someone else, or later, as we get into the 18th, 19th centuries, to work in the new factories with some of their income skimmed off by landlords and employers. Now, just to play this safe here, I'm going to quote Mises. Okay. I'm finding refuge in Mises. Mises has two interesting passages, one in Socialism and one in Human Action. Now, we're talking about landed aristocracy owning huge areas. Okay, we're not talking about a couple acres, you know, we're talking about large, large areas. So, it's interesting that Mises says the following in Socialism. Nowhere and at no time has large-scale ownership of land come into being through the working of economic forces in the market. It is the result of military and political effort. Founded by violence, it has been upheld by violence, and by that alone. As soon as latifundia, and that's these big, huge, you know, estates, as soon as these are drawn into the sphere of the market, of market transactions, they begin to crumble until at last they disappear completely. Neither at their formation nor in their maintenance have economic causes operated. The great landed fortunes did not arise through the economic superiority of large-scale ownership, but through violent annexations outside the area of trade. The non-economic origin of landed fortunes is clearly revealed by the fact that, as a rule, the expropriation by which they have been created in no way alters the manner of production. The old owner, meaning the tiller of the soil, remains on the soil under a different legal title and continues to carry on production. In other words, once the nobility comes and says, this is my land, a lot of the people keep working it. They get some of their income skimmed off by the new landlord, but the means of working the land doesn't change. So Mises is saying that's some of the evidence that these did not come about through economic processes or for economic reasons. Now, about the actual dispossession of people in England, he says in Human Action, but the fact remains that for the surplus population which the enclosure movement had reduced to dire wretchedness, I think that's a very dramatic phrase that he uses. I mean, look, the peasants were not wealthy, right? They weren't living, they didn't have a high standard of living, certainly by later standards or our standards. But they were subsistent, they could live, they raised at least some kids. There might have been high infant mortality, but they managed to live. He says the enclosure movement reduced them to dire wretchedness. And he says, and for which there was literally no room left in the frame of the prevailing system of production. Work in the factories was salvation. So here's Mises saying that, okay, the enclosure movement did release the stealing of the land, did reduce them to wretchedness. Luckily, the factories were there in the cities. They had a place to go. Otherwise, they had no place to go. But we'll see whether that's entirely the case. Okay, so the opportunity, as Mises says, to work in the factories is often presented as salvation, but it looks less benign when the land theft is recognized. In other words, if people are, even if they're streaming to the factories, and we say, look, they're streaming to the factories, demonstrated preference. They must think that's their best opportunity. Well, yeah, given the constraints that has been imposed on them through government power by giving land to the nobility, it might have been their best option. And this comes up in the current debate over the sweatshops. I mean, I've heard very good talks by free market economists that I'm a big fan of, about how it's the people in the third world is their best opportunity, and look what the wage rates are. And my question always is, and I would love to see research on this, is is there any alliance between, say, Nike or whatever the company is, and the government, the local government, that's constraining the choice set for those people? It may be the best choice given the choice set, but if the choice set is constrained artificially, then that tells a different story, right? And when a mugger says to you, your money or your life, and you give your money, I don't think we're going to be satisfied to say, well, he took the best opportunity. What are you complaining about? Demonstrated preference. You want to zoom out a little bit instead of just looking here. What else? what was closed off? So I think those are all fair questions. So I think we a little too easily say, hey, it's the best opportunity, look what they did. Well, there may be more to the story. And it seems that in this period, there was more to the story. Now, some people have gone further to say that a lot of the money that was raised, the capital that was raised to build the factory, some of it was from the savings and the sweat of the people who opened the factories. But some of it also apparently came from old money, from landed nobility. And there's some indication, at least in some parts of England and at some times, the idea was to get them off the land so they would go work in the factories. Turgot, by the way, one of Murray Rothbard's favorite economists, says somewhere that nobody would go work for someone else if you could help it. So the question is, why, if you have a subsistence living in your family, subsistence doesn't mean poor. It just means you're raising enough for yourself. You're not raising a surplus to go sell somewhere. You don't have to be poor to be a subsistence farmer. And we're talking by their standards, of course, not ours. I can see a lot of people saying, well, let's see, do I want to continue doing that, assuming the land hasn't been taken and you're not paying huge rents to a new artificial landlord. Do I want to do that, or do I want to travel into the city and work in the loud, dangerous, dirty mills and have some guy yelling at me who could fire me at any time? It's like, I'm thinking. Maybe it's, we always take the idea that, of course they wanted to go, but maybe they didn't want to go. Maybe they had to go because they were denied other opportunities. There's indication of that. It's not something to be dismissed. There seems to be a lot of historical evidence for this. I think that we too easily overlook or just ignore. And add to that the fact that we find statements made by members of the ruling elite, the landed aristocracy, and other observers, pointing out that, and as one put it, if they work for themselves, they won't work for us. In other words, there was some concern that how are we going to get them to work for us if they can just go off and farm or do something, be an artisan or be something independent. They shared the view of the early 19th century British writer E.G. Wakefield, who said, "Where land is cheap and all men are free, where everyone who so pleases can obtain a piece of land for himself, not only is labor very dear, as respect the laborer's share of the product, but the difficulty is obtained combined labor. The difficulty is to obtain combined labor at any price." Or no matter what you offered, they didn't want to leave the comfort of working at home, even though they weren't, rolling in, in money. And this is also consistent. You find this in Oppenheimer's book, The State, where he discusses why it seems in so many societies you get a few people who own property and a big landed working class, unpropertied, propertyless working class. And it tends to be explained by the few that own the land, the few that own the property were just brighter and smarter, and they saved more, and the rest were sort of dumb and dull, and they didn't, so they had no choice but to go to work for the ones that didn't. Thank goodness those people were there to let us go to work for them. But once you factor in this land situation, the story looks a little different. And Oppenheimer says, there's a lot of land. England had not yet reached the density where there was no land left. So what happened? There must be a political explanation, not an economic explanation. And Oppenheimer, of course, is famous for his conquest theory of the state, which is how he explains it. Okay, so we get industry, we get industrialization. According to Kevin Carson, laissez-faire doesn't begin at this point, even though it's tempting to think so. He writes, factory employers depended on harsh, authoritarian measures by the government to keep labor under control and reduce its bargaining power. In England, the laws of settlement, which by the way were decried by Adam Smith, acted as a sort of internal passport system preventing workers from traveling outside the parish of their birth without government permission. Okay, so there was not freedom of movement even by the people who were, workers looking for the best employment opportunity. Thus, workers were prevented from voting with their, this continuing Carson, were prevented from voting with their feet in search of better paying jobs. The combination laws, which prevented workers from freely associating to bargain with employers, were enforced entirely by administrative law without any protections of common law due process.